Good morning, guys. Happy Tuesday. Sorry this is a little bit later going up. I don't know. You might be asleep still anyway, but had a little internet issue, but I think we've got it all set now. So I'm going to be posting this with no follow-up work because I don't know if this is throwing off your rhythm a little bit. Shouldn't need to do too much reflection on today because we're going to be building on it anyway in the coming days. Um, this is itself, of course, building on what we were doing last week. It's been a few days since we had new information, but remember, last week we were talking about the scientific revolution, where revolution means a change and a shift in understanding as opposed to the onset of science. But here we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment, which is really made up of a lot of philosophers who were really impressed with the effectiveness of science and were searching to find ways to apply scientific thought and research to their fields of study as well, the humanities. Um, I wanted to say one brief thing about the projects before dive into the material, though. I know a few of you had a couple of bumps in the road when it comes to the projects. I just want you to feel completely relaxed about that because we're just working through this together. Don't feel any undue stress about, it was 5 minutes late or it's missing pieces. We'll just work with people, and we're going to be giving lots of grace on that because we're obviously all in this together. Um, if you ever do run into an issue, just let me know, and I promise we'll work through it together. In the meantime, let's dive into the talk for today, the Enlightenment, a very, very influential time period. A lot of the ways culture is today can be traced substantially to the Enlightenment, and that's in good and in negative ways. To be honest, we'll be doing a pretty deep dive into that when you are seniors. So today we'll be mostly just talking about the history of the Enlightenment, because when you're seniors, we're going to be looking more at the impact and all of that. But as we jump into it, one of the things we want to continue to build this bridge of is how did we arrive at the Enlightenment? And we might be able to sort of vaguely say, listen, we've got this Renaissance era, and in the final stages of the Renaissance, we move into scientific revolution, which is in overlap with the exploration of the world that we've studied. New technology makes new exploration possible. The reach of Europe becomes more significant because of the new technology and understanding of the way the world is working. But last little piece of this bridge to build to the Enlightenment is a couple of thinkers who are really, really influential. And these thinkers are going to continue to feed the later Enlightenment thinkers confidence and even desire to continue to investigate the way the world works. Here we have John Locke. I think he's famous enough that you have probably heard of John Locke. He's definitely influential. When we finally are talking about the political influence of the Enlightenment on the United States, for instance, John Locke will come up. He'll be a significant piece of that puzzle. One of the things that he's most famous for writing is this essay concerning human understanding. And the reason it's important for us is that he is going to basically have this idea that human beings are sort of a blank slate. We call it a tabla rasa. A blank slate that is to say the human being will be influenced by their context. And so what he believed was that if you could manage the context, if you could really kind of work on the environment and perfect the environment, then people would improve. And so he has this idea, this sort of double helix of improving society, improving people, improving society. And so he was really interested in this idea of what would it take to improve society? What sorts of things need to be put in place for that to be pulled off? Another person that's going to be influential in this kind of thinking is our friend Sir Isaac Newton. Just like we talked about last week, he's obviously influential in the science side of things. But one of the things that spills over is his understanding that the universe operates under natural law. And so the philosophers of the Enlightenment are going to say, well, I wonder what natural laws govern society. If the universe is governed by natural law, couldn't the economy be governed by natural law? And what if we discovered what that natural law is? Could we then kind of dovetail or streamline our um, our society to match the natural law that governs it? So that's what they went searching for. Um, Probably the epicenter of the Enlightenment is the French philosophers, the philosophes, basically just means philosopher in French. And there's just a couple that I want to highlight because they are so influential, and the impact of the Enlightenment is largely seen in their work. One of them is known to us as Montesquieu, although he has a much longer title, Charles Louis de Secondat, the Baron of Montesquieu. But for us, it's okay just to call him Montesquieu because everybody does. But he's famous for writing a work called The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. You can see we're moving forward in time a little bit here, actually leading towards the American Revolution. Montesquieu is going to have an influence on thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, for instance. But what his interesting question was, what kind of natural law governs the best kinds of political relationships? What would the best government be according to the natural laws? And he said, okay, listen, there's basically three kinds of governments out there. There's republics, there's despots, there's monarchies. And he kind of said, hey, some of them are better for different situations, and you can see the benefits of some versus others depending on the time period or the context. But what he really started to focus in on was this idea that the best governments had branches where the powers were separated between the branches. Most obviously, legislative, executive, and judicial branches, just like what we have in the United States, but also just like what the British had at the time. They had the legislative branch, Parliament. They had the executive branch, which is, you might say, the Prime Minister in conjunction with the King at the time. And then there's the judicial branch, obviously, as well. And what he loved about that was the separation of powers and the availability of checks and balances, so no one group of people had too much influence or too much power. You might see the design of that obviously sort of influencing the United States. And it is interesting to me to note that he thought that the British had a great style of government. He was actually impressed with their design. Two more French philosophers. This guy might actually be the most famous because of his wits and his very cutting rhetorical style. Everyone just calls him Voltaire, Francois-Marie Arouet. He's often noted for his criticism of Christianity and his advocacy of religious tolerance in France. He wanted the church to lose power. He wanted the Catholic Church to be sort of brought into check, and often talked about separation of church and state as well. And he actually championed the belief set of deism, which you might know about, but remember, if you do, that it's this idea that God exists, but God is not relevant to our world. He doesn't interact with our world. You could start to see that belief set sort of foundationally coming out of the Enlightenment in more significant numbers than prior to. Last French philosopher that we want to talk about is this man, Denis Diderot. And he's not all that different in his work or aim from Voltaire, but he produces this encyclopedia, this classified dictionary of the sciences, arts, and trades, and he wanted it to be very widespread. He tried to get that out there to a lot of different people. And he wanted very influential people to be reading these articles. And these articles from the encyclopedia basically were attacking old French societal norms, the nobility, the way that the government was set up, the way that the church had too much power. And he was making an effort at sort of overturning this apple cart, so to speak. And it's, impactful. Guys like Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot are going to have a huge impact on both the American Revolution and the French Revolution in their re-examining of things that had been long accepted as being just the way things are. They say, well, it doesn't have to be that way. What if there's a better way to do it? And this is a way of thinking that is, we might call modern, optimistic, that they can solve societal issues, refine societal models, and bring about a better world. There are two other people that are working in that regard that I'd like to mention here before wrapping up. One is Adam Smith. He is actually a Scottish philosopher in the British Empire at the time, working with a group called the Physiocrats, and they were looking for natural law in the economy. And basically, they came to the conclusion that the natural law in the economy that governs the way the economy should work is this idea that if everybody looks out for their own self-interest, it'll balance out, and actually all of society will benefit. This led them to assert that the government should not be involved in the economy, which is interesting because, remember, the era that we're talking about has a economic system called mercantilism, where the government is highly involved in what's going on in the economy. But Adam Smith and the Physiocrats said, no, it should be laissez-faire. We should let the people do what they want. The government should not be involved in that. The government should really only be involved in the private sector so far as doing things that the private sector can't do. Police work, an army to protect the nation, building roads and canals and those sorts of things that will benefit all of society that maybe the private sector doesn't have the means to do, but really the government should be sort of hands off. Adam Smith talked about there being this invisible hand that will govern the economy. The invisible hand includes a concept of supply and demand. If you have too much supply and not enough demand, prices will fall. If you have not enough supply but a lot of demand, then prices will go up. And he talked about this natural law being all that is really needed to govern the economy, and that the government should be out of there. Last guy here is Cesar Beccaria, very famous for his examination of the judicial system and especially punishment. And he comes up with some phrases and some assertions and beliefs that find their way even into our Bill of Rights. His phrase that punishments should not be cruel and unusual show up in the Bill of Rights. And so he argued against the idea that these punishments that are excessive, that are in the judicial system, he argued against it because he thought they were not effective and he thought they were immoral. He actually argues against capital punishment, which you probably know is the death penalty. So what we end up with then, with all of these different thinkers, are people who are examining and re-examining the way life is, the way the society is set up, and it's leading to a desire for change and a confidence that change can be had, and a belief that change will be positive. And this Enlightenment optimism is going to spill out into the revolutions that we're most interested in, the American Revolution and the French Revolution.